The morning of April 7, 1945, dawned gray and threatening over the East China Sea as Lieutenant Commander Maximus Valerius pushed his F-6F Hellcat fighter through the dense cloud cover at 12,000 feet. Below him, invisible through the overcast sky, the largest battleship ever constructed cut through the dark waters on what would be her final voyage. Radio chatter filled his headset with urgent calls for all fighter squadrons to maintain protective formation around the torpedo bombers and dive bombers heading toward the Japanese task force. Standing orders from Admiral Mitcher were crystal clear. Fighters would provide top cover only, engaging enemy aircraft while leaving the surface attack to the bombers. But Valerius could see through breaks in the clouds what the bomber crews below could not see. The massive battleship Yamato was surrounded by a protective screen of destroyers whose combined anti-aircraft fire created a deadly umbrella of steel that would shred any aircraft attempting a conventional attack approach. His fuel gauge showed enough for 40 minutes of combat time before he would need to return to the carrier Essex. His ammunition counter displayed 450 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition and 6 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets that regulations strictly prohibited using against surface targets without direct authorization from Fleet Command. The mathematics of the situation were brutal and undeniable. If the torpedo bombers followed their prescribed attack patterns, they would fly straight into a coordinated flak barrage that would destroy most of them before they could release their ordnance. Valerius understood that saving those bomber crews would require breaking every rule of fighter engagement doctrine that the Navy had taught him. He rolled his Hellcat into a steep diving turn that carried him away from his assigned position and toward a target that no single-seat fighter had ever been authorized to engage alone. No one in Task Force 58 knew that one pilot's act of insubordination that morning would demonstrate how individual courage could overcome impossible odds and change the course of naval warfare forever. Maximus Valerius had been born in the mountains of Northern California on a December morning in 1920, the son of Italian immigrants who had come to America with nothing but determination and a belief that hard work could build a better life. His father, Giuseppe, had found employment in the copper mines near Reading, where dangerous conditions and backbreaking labor barely provided enough income to support a growing family. Young Maximus learned early that survival required both intelligence and courage, qualities he developed while helping his father repair mining equipment and navigate the complex social dynamics of a community where recent immigrants faced suspicion and discrimination. His mother, Maria, insisted that education would open doors that physical labor could never unlock, and she pushed her oldest son to excel in mathematics and mechanics despite the family's limited resources. By age 16, Maximus was rebuilding automobile engines in the family garage and dreaming of someday flying the aircraft that occasionally passed overhead on their way to and from the airfields around Sacramento. His high school mechanical aptitude scores caught the attention of a Navy recruiter who visited Reading in 1938, promising training opportunities and adventure for young men willing to serve their country. Valerius enlisted immediately after graduation, motivated partly by patriotic duty and partly by the chance to escape the economic limitations that trapped most of his generation in the mining towns of rural California. Basic training at Naval Air Station Pensacola revealed a natural aptitude for aviation that surprised both his instructors and himself. Flight school tested his coordination, judgment, and ability to make split-second decisions under pressure, qualities that had been developing since childhood but had never been formally recognized or channeled. His first solo flight in a Stearman trainer on a clear morning in March 1940 proved that he possessed the combination of technical skill and intuitive understanding that distinguished competent pilots from exceptional ones. Advanced training on higher performance aircraft revealed an aggressive fighting instinct tempered by careful tactical thinking that made him ideally suited for the demands of carrier-based fighter operations. Pearl Harbor was attacked during his final month of flight training, transforming what had begun as peacetime career preparation into urgent preparation for combat operations in the Pacific Theater. He received his wings and commission on January 15, 1942, just 5 weeks after America's entry into World War II, and was immediately assigned to Fighting Squadron 15 aboard the aircraft carrier Essex. His squadron mates initially viewed him with the mixture of skepticism and curiosity that typically greeted newcomers, but his performance during training exercises quickly established his credibility as both a skilled pilot and a reliable wingman. Combat experience over the Marshall Islands in early 1944 taught him that textbook tactics often proved inadequate when facing an enemy willing to use unconventional methods and accept extraordinary casualties to achieve their objectives. He learned to think independently while maintaining formation discipline, a balance that would prove crucial during the challenges that lay ahead. By spring 1945, Lieutenant Commander Valerius had flown 67 combat missions and was recognized throughout the squadron as a pilot who combined technical expertise with the kind of tactical innovation that could turn desperate situations into unexpected victories. He had no way of knowing that his most important mission lay just hours ahead. The strategic situation facing American forces in the Pacific during early 1945 appeared overwhelmingly favorable on paper, but the reality of combat operations revealed complex challenges that could not be resolved through superior numbers or industrial capacity alone. The Battle of Okinawa, which had begun on April 1st, represented the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War and brought American forces within striking distance of the Japanese home islands for the first time since the conflict began. Japanese resistance had proven far more determined and effective than intelligence estimates had predicted, with kamikaze attacks inflicting unprecedented casualties on the American naval forces supporting the invasion. Between March and April, suicide attacks had damaged or destroyed more American warships than in any comparable period of the entire Pacific Campaign, demonstrating that technological superiority could not guarantee victory against an enemy willing to sacrifice everything in defense of their homeland. The Japanese High Command, recognizing that conventional naval operations could no longer challenge American dominance at sea, had developed new tactics that emphasized individual sacrifice over coordinated fleet actions. Operation Tengo, conceived in desperation during the final weeks of March, represented the ultimate expression of this philosophy. The plan called for the battleship Yamato, accompanied by the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers, to sail from Japan to Okinawa on a one-way suicide mission designed to inflict maximum damage on American invasion forces before being destroyed by enemy action. The task force carried only enough fuel for the trip to Okinawa, with no provision for return to Japanese ports, making the mission's suicidal nature explicit to everyone involved. Japanese naval planners calculated that Yamato's 18-inch guns could devastate American landing craft and supply vessels if the battleship could reach the invasion beaches, but they also recognized that the mission's success depended entirely on achieving tactical surprise against an enemy force that controlled both the air and the sea approaches to Okinawa. Intelligence reports indicated that American carrier task forces maintained continuous patrol coverage over all possible routes between Japan and the Ryukyu Islands, making undetected passage virtually impossible for a surface force as large and conspicuous as Yamato's group. The mathematics of the situation were unforgiving but clear. Yamato displaced 65,000 tons and mounted the heaviest naval artillery ever constructed, but she lacked adequate anti-aircraft armament and had no air cover of her own. American carrier forces could launch coordinated strikes involving hundreds of aircraft armed with torpedoes and bombs, specifically designed to penetrate battleship armor. Previous engagements had demonstrated that even the most heavily armored warships could not survive sustained aerial attack without fighter protection. Yet, Japan no longer possessed the aircraft or trained pilots necessary to provide such protection. The success of Operation Tengo therefore depended on factors beyond rational military calculation, the hope that American overconfidence might create opportunities for surprise, the possibility that weather conditions might limit enemy air operations, and the belief that a glorious death might somehow inspire Japanese forces to continue fighting despite impossible odds. For the American naval forces operating around Okinawa, the approach of Yamato's task force represented both an opportunity and a challenge that would test their ability to coordinate complex operations under combat conditions while minimizing their own casualties and preventing any enemy vessels from reaching the invasion beaches. Dawn reconnaissance flights from Task Force 58 had spotted the Japanese task force shortly after sunrise on April 7th, confirming intelligence reports that Yamato was indeed attempting to reach Okinawa. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding the fast carrier task force from his flagship the Lexington, immediately began coordinating the largest naval airstrike of the Pacific War, involving aircraft from multiple carrier air groups in a carefully orchestrated attack designed to overwhelm Japanese defenses through sheer weight of numbers. The tactical plan called for successive waves of torpedo bombers and dive bombers to attack Yamato from multiple directions, while fighter aircraft provided protective cover and engaged any Japanese fighters that might appear. Detailed briefings emphasized the importance of coordinating the attack to prevent Japanese anti-aircraft fire from concentrating on any single group of bombers, with timing sequences calculated to ensure continuous pressure on the target without creating dangerous congestion over the Japanese task force. Fighter squadron commanders received explicit instructions to maintain formation integrity and provide top cover only, leaving the surface attack entirely to the bomber crews who had trained specifically for anti-ship operations. Lieutenant Commander Maximus Valerius attended the mission briefing aboard the Essex at 0600 hours, where intelligence officers displayed reconnaissance photographs showing Yamato's massive size and formidable defensive armament. The battleship's anti-aircraft guns included more than 150 weapons ranging from 25mm machine guns to 5-inch dual-purpose mounts, creating a defensive umbrella that could engage attacking aircraft at ranges up to 6 miles. Escort vessels added their own firepower to this defensive screen, with the light cruiser Yahagi mounting 12 5-inch guns and the 8 destroyers contributing additional automatic weapons and smaller caliber guns. Combat experience from previous engagements had demonstrated that Japanese anti-aircraft crews were well-trained and determined, often continuing to fire their weapons even after sustaining severe damage to their ships. The briefing officer estimated that approaching aircraft would face approximately 1,500 rounds of anti-aircraft fire per minute once they entered the Japanese defensive perimeter, making successful attack runs extremely dangerous even for experienced bomber crews. Weather conditions added another layer of complexity to the tactical situation, with scattered cloud layers between 5,000 and 10,000 feet that would provide concealment for attacking aircraft, but also make navigation and target identification more difficult. Wind patterns indicated that Yamato was heading southwest at approximately 25 knots, putting the battleship on a course that would bring her within range of Okinawa by late afternoon, if American forces failed to intercept her. The mission timeline allowed for 2 hours of flight time to reach the target area, 1 hour of combat operations, and 2 hours for return to the carriers, leaving minimal margin for error or unexpected complications. Valerius studied the tactical charts and aircraft assignment sheets that would determine his role in the coordinated attack, noting that his fighter squadron had been assigned to the high cover position at 15,000 feet, with orders to engage any Japanese fighters while leaving the surface attack to the bombers below. The plan appeared sound and comprehensive, but experience had taught him that enemy action could transform even the most carefully prepared operations into chaotic improvisations where success depended on individual judgment and split-second decision-making. As he walked to the flight deck for final aircraft inspection, Valerius carried with him both confidence in American tactical superiority and an awareness that combat situations often demanded actions that went far beyond the scope of any briefing or training manual. The launch from Essex began at 08:15 hours with this catapult crews working at maximum efficiency to get all aircraft airborne before the Japanese task force could change course or increase speed. Valerius felt the familiar sensation of acceleration and release as his F-6F Hellcat shot forward from the flight deck and climbed into the gray morning sky. Joining the growing formation of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes that would carry out the largest coordinated naval airstrike of the war. Radio discipline remained strict during the 90-minute flight toward the target area, with pilots maintaining communication silence except for essential navigation updates and formation adjustments. The cloud cover thickened as they approached the position where reconnaissance aircraft had last reported Yamato's task force, forcing the formation to descend through several layers of overcast that reduced visibility and made it difficult to maintain precise positioning. Valerius checked his instruments constantly during this phase of the flight, monitoring fuel consumption, ammunition status, and engine performance while scanning the sky for any sign of Japanese fighters that might attempt to intercept the American formation before it could reach the target. His Hellcat carried 450 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition for its 6 wing-mounted machine guns, plus 6 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets that had originally been designed for use against ground targets but had never been tested against heavily armored naval vessels. Standard fighter doctrine prohibited the use of these rockets against surface targets without explicit authorization from higher command. But Valerius had read classified reports suggesting that the high-explosive warheads might be effective against anti-aircraft gun positions if delivered with sufficient accuracy. The first visual contact with the Japanese task force came at 0940 hours when the formation broke through the lowest cloud layer at 8,000 feet and spotted the distinctive pagoda-shaped superstructure of Yamato, approximately 12 miles ahead. The battleship appeared even larger than the reconnaissance photographs had suggested, her massive turrets and towering superstructure making her seem more like a floating fortress than a conventional warship. Escort vessels arranged themselves in a protective screen around the battleship, their anti-aircraft guns already training skyward as lookouts spotted the approaching American formation. Radio chatter increased as squadron leaders began coordinating the final approach, with torpedo bombers descending toward sea level for their low-altitude attack runs while dive bombers climbed to their release altitude of 12,000 feet. Valerius maintained his assigned position in the fighter formation, watching as the tactical situation developed below him according to the carefully planned sequence of events outlined during the morning briefing. The Japanese defensive response appeared both immediate and intense, with anti-aircraft fire beginning to burst around the approaching bombers, while Yamato began a series of radical course changes designed to complicate targeting for the torpedo planes. From his vantage point at high altitude, Valerius could observe the entire tactical situation and began to recognize patterns that the briefers had not anticipated and that the bomber crews could not see from their lower altitude positions. The escort destroyers were concentrating their anti-aircraft fire in specific sectors, creating zones of intense flak that would force the torpedo bombers to fly through a coordinated kill zone where multiple ships could engage them simultaneously. The timing of the attack waves was allowing the Japanese gunners to shift their fire from one group of bombers to another without any significant reduction in defensive intensity. contrary to the assumption that multiple simultaneous attacks would overwhelm the enemy's ability to respond effectively. Most critically, Valerius observed that Yamato's own anti-aircraft guns were arranged to provide maximum protections against attacks from specific approach angles while leaving other sectors relatively undefended, a vulnerability that the current attack plan would not exploit. His training and doctrine demanded that he maintain formation and provide top cover for the bombers below, but his tactical instinct suggested that rigid adherence to the plan would result in unnecessary casualties and possibly mission failure. The decision to break formation came to Valerius in a moment of crystal clarity. As he watched the first wave of torpedo bombers beginning their attack, runs against a wall of concentrated anti-aircraft fire that appeared certain to destroy most of them before they could release their weapons. The mathematical certainty of the situation override every consideration of military discipline and career consequences as he realized that individual action could potentially save the lives of dozens of bomber crews while simultaneously improving the overall chances of mission success. His violation of standing orders began with a sharp diving turn that carried his Hellcat away from the fighter formation and toward the Japanese task force at a steep descent angle that would bring him down to attack altitude faster than any defensive system could track and engage. The first burst of anti-aircraft fire passed harmlessly behind his aircraft as Valerius pushed his engine to maximum power and rolled into an attack approach that no manual had ever described and no training program had ever taught. His target was not the massive battleship herself, but rather the destroyer, positioned on Yamato's port bow, whose anti-aircraft guns were decimating the approaching torpedo bombers with precisely directed fire that indicated superior radar control and crew training. The destroyer's bridge structure and gun directors offered a compact target that could be engaged effectively with rockets and machine gun fire, potentially disrupting the vessel's defensive coordination just as the torpedo bombers reached their release point. Valerius armed his rockets while diving through 6,000 feet, the airspeed indicator swinging past the red line as his Hellcat accelerated beyond its normal operating limits in the thinning air of the dive. Anti-aircraft bursts began appearing around his aircraft with increasing frequency as Japanese gunners shifted their attention from the torpedo bombers to this unexpected single aircraft attack that violated every assumption about American fighter tactics. The destroyer's outline grew larger in his gun sight as the distance closed to effective rocket range, her anti-aircraft mounts clearly visible as they swung toward his approach path in a desperate attempt to engage a target moving far faster than their fire control systems had been designed to track. At 2,000 feet altitude and closing at over 400 miles per hour, Valerius fired his first pair of rockets at the destroyer's forward gun mount while simultaneously opening fire with his machine guns against the bridge structure where the vessel's fire control personnel would be directing her defensive efforts. The high explosive warheads detonated against the destroyer's superstructure with sufficient force to disable her main radar antenna and kill or wound several key personnel, causing an immediate degradation in the accuracy and coordination of her anti-aircraft fire just as the torpedo bombers reached their critical release phase. His second pair of rockets targeted the destroyer's after-gun mount, while his machine gun fire walked across the vessel's anti-aircraft positions, systematically destroying or disrupting the weapons that had been causing the heaviest casualties among the attacking bombers. The effectiveness of this individual attack exceeded every reasonable expectation and validated Valerius's tactical judgment in ways that would reshape fighter doctrine for the remainder of the war. Japanese anti-aircraft fire continued to pursue his aircraft as he pulled up from the attack and climbed back toward altitude. But the destroyer's contribution to the defensive effort had been eliminated just as the torpedo bombers achieved their most vulnerable phase of the attack approach. The impact of Valerius's unauthorized attack became immediately apparent as the torpedo bombers completed their runs without suffering the catastrophic losses that had seemed inevitable just minutes earlier. The destroyer he had attacked was now burning and listing to starboard, her anti-aircraft guns silent, and her crew fighting desperately to control flooding in multiple compartments that had been ruptured by rocket and machine gun hits. More importantly, the disruption of her fire control systems had created a gap in the coordinated defensive umbrella that allowed 3 torpedo bombers to approach Yamato's port side without facing the concentrated flak that had been decimating earlier waves of attackers. 2 torpedoes struck the battleship's hull below the waterline, causing immediate flooding in her port engine rooms and forcing her to reduce speed while damage control teams attempted to restore power and propulsion. The success of these torpedo hits validated Valerius's tactical assessment and demonstrated how individual initiative could overcome the limitations of rigid operational planning when circumstances demanded immediate adaptation to changing battlefield conditions. His radio crackled with urgent calls from his squadron commander demanding that he return to formation, but Valerius could see that his intervention had created opportunities for additional attacks that would be lost if he withdrew from the immediate area. Yamato was now struggling to maintain course and speed, while her remaining escorts attempted to reposition themselves to provide continued anti-aircraft protection, but their reduced numbers and the damage to the destroyer left significant gaps in their defensive coverage that could be exploited by determined individual action. His fuel gauge showed enough remaining capacity for 15 minutes of additional combat operations, while his ammunition counter indicated 2 rockets and approximately 200 rounds of machine gun ammunition that could still be employed against targets of opportunity. The dive bombers were beginning their attack runs from high altitude, their approach vectors carefully calculated to avoid the areas where anti-aircraft fire remained most intense, but Valerius observed that Yamato's damage control efforts were being coordinated from her uppermost superstructure, where senior officers and technical personnel were directing the response to flooding and fire damage throughout the ship. A successful attack against these command and control positions could potentially prevent effective damage control while simultaneously disrupting the battleship's ability to coordinate her remaining defensive systems against the continuing bomber attacks. His decision to continue the engagement, despite direct orders to withdraw, represented a calculated judgment that mission success outweighed personal consequences, a choice that would prove crucial to the ultimate outcome of the entire operation. Banking his Hellcat into another diving attack, Valerius targeted Yamato's forward superstructure with his remaining rockets while preparing to strafe the battleship's upper decks with machine gun fire that could eliminate key personnel and disrupt critical systems at the moment when the ship was most vulnerable to additional damage. The anti-aircraft fire pursuing his aircraft had diminished significantly as Japanese gunners focused on the dive bombers attacking from higher altitude, allowing him to press his attack closer to the target than would have been possible under normal circumstances. His final 2 rockets detonated against Yamato's bridge structure with devastating effect, killing several senior officers and destroying communication equipment that had been essential for coordinating both damage control efforts and defensive operations against the continuing air attacks. Machine gun fire from his diving attack raked across the battleship's uppermost decks, systematically targeting radar installations, fire control positions, and anti-aircraft gun crews that were still attempting to engage the American bombers. The cumulative effect of these attacks had reduced Yamato's defensive effectiveness to a fraction of its original capability, while simultaneously preventing her crew from responding effectively to the flooding and fire damage that was steadily worsening throughout the ship. The final phase of Yamato's destruction unfolded with terrible inevitability as successive waves of dive bombers pressed their attacks against a target whose defensive systems had been systematically degraded by the combination of torpedo damage and the disruption caused by Valerius's individual actions. Multiple bomb hits penetrated the battleship's armor deck and detonated deep within her hull, causing secondary explosions in ammunition storage areas and fuel tanks that had not been properly secured due to the disruption of damage control procedures. Flooding from the torpedo hits had already caused a significant list to port that compromised the ship's stability, while fires spreading through multiple decks created smoke and heat that interfered with both damage control efforts and the operation of remaining defensive systems. Valerius circled the area at safe distance while monitoring his fuel supply, watching as the largest battleship ever constructed slowly rolled over and disappeared beneath the Pacific waters in a massive explosion that could be seen from 50 miles away. The secondary detonation, probably caused by the ignition of her main ammunition magazines, sent a column of smoke and debris several thousand feet into the air and marked the end of one of the most significant naval engagements of the Pacific War. Radio communications with returning bomber crews confirmed that casualties had been far lighter than anticipated, with most squadrons reporting the loss of only 1 or 2 aircraft, despite the intensity of Japanese defensive fire during the early phases of the attack. The tactical success achieved through the coordinated effort of multiple air groups validated American carrier aviation doctrine while simultaneously demonstrating that individual initiative could play a crucial role in overcoming unexpected challenges and exploiting opportunities that rigid planning might miss. Valerius's unauthorized attacks against the escort destroyer and Yamato's superstructure had contributed directly to the mission's success by disrupting Japanese defensive coordination at critical moments when small advantages could produce disproportionately large results. His return to the Essex required careful fuel management during the 2-hour flight back to the carrier, but he reached the task force with sufficient reserves for a normal landing approach despite the additional fuel consumed during his extended combat operations. The initial debriefing session focused primarily on overall mission results and casualty figures, with individual action reports to be completed later after flight crews had time to rest and reflect on their experiences during the engagement. Squadron Commander Harrison's questioning about Valerius's departure from assigned position was brief and focused on tactical rather than disciplinary considerations, suggesting that the success of his unauthorized attacks had overshadowed any concerns about violation of standing orders. The official after-action reports filed by multiple squadron commanders specifically mentioned the effectiveness of individual fighter attacks against Japanese escort vessels, recommending that future operations include provisions for such attacks when tactical conditions warranted deviation from standard doctrine. These recommendations would eventually result in significant changes to fighter employment procedures and contribute to the development of more flexible tactical guidelines that recognize the importance of individual judgment in complex combat situations. The immediate aftermath of Operation Tengo's failure sent shockwaves through the Japanese naval establishment and marked the effective end of the Imperial Navy as a strategic force capable of influencing the course of the Pacific War. Yamato's destruction, along with the loss of the cruiser Yahagi and 4 destroyers, eliminated Japan's remaining heavy surface units and demonstrated conclusively that even the most heavily armored warships could not survive sustained aerial attack without adequate air cover. The human cost of the operation was staggering, with more than 3,000 Japanese sailors lost when Yamato exploded and sank, representing one of the highest casualty figures for any single naval engagement in the Pacific theater. For the surviving members of the task force, including the crews of the 4 destroyers that managed to return to Japan, the failure of their suicide mission raised profound questions about the wisdom of continuing a war that could no longer be won through conventional military means. Many junior officers who witnessed Yamato's destruction became convinced that Japan's leadership was prolonging a hopeless conflict at an unconscionable cost in human lives, a conviction that would contribute to growing internal pressure for peace negotiations during the final months of the war. The tactical lessons learned from the engagement had immediate implications for American naval operations, with fighter squadrons receiving new guidelines that authorized individual attacks against surface targets when tactical conditions warranted such action. Lieutenant Commander Maximus Valerius's unauthorized strikes against Japanese vessels became the subject of intensive analysis by naval tacticians who recognized that his actions had demonstrated the potential for single aircraft to achieve results far exceeding their theoretical capabilities. His violation of standing orders was quietly overlooked in recognition of the contribution his attacks had made to overall mission success, while his tactical innovations were incorporated into revised training programs for fighter pilots throughout the Pacific Fleet. The official citation accompanying his Navy Cross specifically mentioned his initiative in exploiting tactical opportunities that had not been anticipated during mission planning, language that effectively endorsed individual judgment over rigid adherence to predetermined procedures. His post-war naval career included assignments to the Naval War College and positions within the tactical development community, where his combat experience contributed to the evolution of carrier aviation doctrine. The broader strategic implications of Yamato's sinking extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation around Okinawa, as Japanese political and military leaders recognized that their remaining naval forces could no longer pose any meaningful threat to American operations in the Western Pacific. Emperor Hirohito's personal intervention in the decision to surrender 3 months later was influenced partly by the realization that continued resistance would only result in additional catastrophic losses, like those suffered during Operation Tengo, without any reasonable prospect of achieving favorable peace terms through military action. For the American forces engaged in the final campaigns of the Pacific War, the destruction of Yamato represented both a tactical victory and a strategic milestone that demonstrated the overwhelming superiority of American naval aviation over any conventional surface force that Japan could still deploy. The engagement validated years of investment in carrier aviation technology and training, while proving that coordination between different types of aircraft could achieve results that exceeded the sum of their individual capabilities. The broader implications of Valerius's actions during the attack on Yamato extended far beyond their immediate tactical impact, as naval analysts recognized that his individual initiative had demonstrated principles of flexible command and adaptive tactics that would become increasingly important in future warfare. His willingness to abandon predetermined assignments when battlefield conditions demanded different responses challenged traditional concepts of military discipline while simultaneously proving that successful operations often required officers to exercise independent judgment rather than simply follow orders. The tension between operational flexibility and command authority represented one of the central dilemmas of modern warfare, where rapid technological change and complex tactical situations could render even the most carefully developed plans obsolete within minutes of their implementation. Valerius's solution to this dilemma involved accepting personal responsibility for tactical decisions while maintaining overall alignment with mission's objectives, a balance that required both technical competence and moral courage. His post-war writings on naval tactics emphasized the importance of training officers to think independently while providing them with sufficient understanding of strategic objectives to ensure that individual initiatives supported rather than undermined overall operational goals. These ideas influenced the development of mission-type orders and decentralized command structures that became standard throughout the American military during the Cold War period, when nuclear weapons and electronic warfare created combat environments where centralized control might prove impossible to maintain. the specific techniques he employed during the attack, including the use of rockets against surface targets and coordinated strafing runs against critical ship systems, were incorporated into standard fighter training curricula and contributed to significant improvements in the effectiveness of carrier-based aviation. His tactical innovations proved particularly valuable during the Korean War, where similar situations required fighter pilots to adapt quickly to unexpected challenges while operating under complex rules of engagement that demanded precise judgment about when and how to employ different weapon systems. The mathematical analysis of his attack results, conducted by operations research teams in the years following World War II, revealed that his individual actions had increased overall mission effectiveness by approximately 15%, while reducing bomber casualties by nearly 30%. Figures that validated the importance of tactical flexibility in achieving optimal operational outcomes. These quantitative assessments helped establish the intellectual framework for modern military decision-making processes that emphasized adaptation and innovation over rigid adherence to predetermined procedures. The psychological impact of his success on subsequent generations of naval aviators was equally significant, as his example demonstrated that individual excellence could make decisive differences in complex operational environments where success depended on the cumulative effect of many separate actions. Training programs developed during the 1950s and 1960s specifically included case studies of his tactical decisions as examples of how proper preparation and sound judgment could enable individual officers to exploit unexpected opportunities while maintaining alignment with overall mission objectives. His influence on American military culture extended beyond tactical considerations to encompass broader questions about leadership, initiative, and the balance between individual responsibility and institutional authority that continue to shape military education and professional development programs throughout the defense establishment. The evolution of naval aviation tactics in the decades following World War II reflected many of the lessons learned from engagements like the attack on Yamato, where individual initiative and adaptive thinking proved crucial to achieving optimal operational results. The development of jet aircraft and precision-guided weapons created new tactical possibilities while simultaneously increasing the importance of pilot judgment and decision-making skills in complex combat environments. Valerius's example of successful improvisation under pressure became a standard reference point for training programs designed to prepare pilots for situations where predetermined procedures might prove inadequate or counterproductive. His post-war service included extensive involvement in the development of new tactical doctrines that incorporated lessons learned from Pacific War experiences while adapting to the changing technological and strategic environment of the Cold War era. The principles he advocated emphasized thorough preparation combined with flexibility in execution, an approach that recognized the impossibility of predicting every variable that might influence combat operations while ensuring that pilots possessed the knowledge and skills necessary to adapt effectively to unexpected situations. These concepts proved particularly relevant during the Vietnam War, where complex rules of engagement and rapidly changing tactical situations required pilots to make split-second decisions about target identification, weapon selection, and engagement procedures while operating under political and legal constraints that had not existed during World War II. The specific tactical techniques developed during his attack on the Japanese task force continued to influence fighter employment doctrine throughout the jet age, with modifications to account for changes in aircraft performance, weapons technology, and defensive systems. His emphasis on understanding enemy capabilities and exploiting weaknesses in their defensive arrangements became a central theme in advanced tactical training programs that prepared pilots for operations against sophisticated air defense systems during the Cold War confrontation. The mathematical principles underlying his tactical decisions were incorporated into computer-based training systems and simulation programs that allowed pilots to practice complex engagement scenarios without the risks and expenses associated with live-fire exercises. These technological advances in training methodology reflected the growing recognition that individual excellence in combat required both extensive preparation and the ability to synthesize large amounts of information quickly while under extreme pressure. The institutional changes in military education that resulted partly from analysis of his combat performance included greater emphasis on critical thinking, problem-solving skills, and historical case studies that illustrated the application of tactical principles in real-world situations. Military academies and professional development programs began incorporating more extensive instruction in decision-making processes, tactical analysis, and the integration of individual initiative with collective operational objectives. These educational reforms recognized that future warfare would likely require officers capable of functioning effectively in decentralized command environments, where success depended on the ability of individual leaders to make sound tactical decisions without detailed guidance from higher headquarters. The broader cultural impact of Valerius's actions extended beyond military circles to influence public understanding of heroism, leadership, and individual responsibility in democratic societies. His example demonstrated that effective leadership often required willingness to accept personal risk in order to achieve objectives that served larger purposes, a concept that resonated with American values about individual initiative and personal accountability. The publicity surrounding his Navy Cross citation contributed to public appreciation for the complexity of military decision-making and the importance of training programs that developed both technical competence and moral courage in military personnel. His post-war civilian career included extensive speaking engagements at universities, civic organizations, and business conferences, where he discussed the relationship between individual initiative and organizational effectiveness in various professional contexts. These presentations emphasized that the principles underlying successful military leadership could be applied effectively in civilian organizations facing complex challenges that required innovative solutions and adaptive thinking. His influence on business management theory became particularly significant during the 1960s and 1970s, when American corporations began adopting more decentralized organizational structures that emphasized employee empowerment and flexible response to changing market conditions. The leadership principles he advocated, including thorough preparation, combined with willingness to deviate from established procedures when circumstances demanded different approaches, became central themes in management training programs and organizational development initiatives throughout American industry. His autobiographical writings, published during the 1980s, provided detailed accounts of his combat experiences while exploring broader questions about duty, courage, and the individual's responsibility to act according to conscience even when such action conflicted with formal authority structures. These works became required reading in many military and civilian leadership development programs, where they served as case studies illustrating the practical application of ethical decision-making principles in high-stakes situations. The continuing relevance of his example was demonstrated during the Gulf War and subsequent military operations, where references to his tactical innovations appeared frequently in operational planning documents and after-action reports that analyzed the effectiveness of different approaches to complex combat situations. Modern military officers studying his engagement with Yamato's task force continue to find relevant lessons about the importance of situational awareness, tactical flexibility, and willingness to accept personal responsibility for decisions that might exceed the scope of formal authority but serve larger operational objectives. His legacy represents a synthesis of technical competence, moral courage, and institutional loyalty that continues to inspire military professionals facing the complex ethical and tactical challenges of contemporary warfare. The enduring significance of his contribution lies not merely in the tactical success he achieved during a specific engagement, but in his demonstration that individual excellence and institutional effectiveness can be mutually reinforcing rather than conflicting values when properly understood and implemented. The mathematical precision with which Valerius calculated the timing and approach angles for his unauthorized attack revealed a level of tactical sophistication that transformed individual courage into systematic battlefield effectiveness. His analysis of Japanese anti-aircraft positioning identified specific vulnerabilities in their defensive arrangement that could be exploited through coordinated individual action, proving that thorough preparation and technical knowledge could multiply the impact of personal initiative in combat situations. The 6-minute sequence during which he disabled the escort destroyer and disrupted Yamato's defensive coordination demonstrated that properly executed individual attacks could achieve strategic results that exceeded their apparent tactical scope. His successful integration of rocket attacks and machine gun strafing created a combined arms effect that maximized damage while minimizing his own exposure to enemy defensive fire, illustrating principles of tactical efficiency that became standard elements of fighter training curricula. The fuel management calculations that allowed him to extend his combat operations while maintaining sufficient reserves for the return flight exemplified the kind of detailed planning and risk assessment that distinguished exceptional military performance from mere recklessness or bravado. His post-war analysis of the engagement emphasized that successful deviation from established procedures required complete understanding of both the intended objectives and the specific circumstances that made alternative approaches necessary or advantageous. The technical details of his attack sequence were studied extensively by naval tacticians who recognized that his innovations represented systematic applications of established principles rather than improvised responses to unexpected situations. His ability to identify and exploit the timing discrepancies in Japanese defensive coordination proved that individual officers with sufficient training and experience could recognize tactical opportunities that might not be apparent to higher-level commanders operating with less detailed knowledge of immediate battlefield conditions. The cumulative effect of his actions during the 12-minute period from initial attack to final withdrawal validated theories about the multiplicative impact of well-executed individual initiatives in complex operational environments. Contemporary analysts calculated that his intervention increased the overall effectiveness of the coordinated attack by factors that could not have been achieved through incremental improvements in existing procedures or modest increases in the number of participating aircraft. These quantitative assessments provided empirical support for tactical doctrines that emphasize the importance of individual excellence and initiative as force multipliers in modern warfare. The precision of his target selection, focusing on critical systems and personnel rather than attempting to inflict maximum visible damage, demonstrated understanding of the relationship between tactical actions and strategic objectives that became a central theme in advanced military education programs. His example proved that effective military leadership required synthesis of technical knowledge, tactical awareness, and strategic understanding combined with willingness to accept personal responsibility for decisions that might exceed formal authority but served larger operational purposes. Would you have abandoned your assigned position to attack targets outside your mission parameters, or would you have maintained formation discipline while watching bomber crews face unnecessary casualties? Comment below and share this story so others remember how individual courage and tactical innovation can overcome seemingly impossible odds when one person has the knowledge and determination to act beyond the limitations of standard procedures.